A young woman is found dead inside her Ohio apartment, not long after two women, similar in age and looks, have been murdered not far away. Police begin an investigation marred in controversy. 40-something years later, two tenacious investigators pick up the pieces of the case and run with it, producing the answers family members have been searching for all their lives. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me. We're crossing the line. Debra Miller is a senior at Malabar High School. It's the spring of 1981. Debra is enjoying the best year of her schooling life as the end of April approaches and she can see signs of graduation just around the corner. Within a month or so, Debra will be free to do what she has dreamt of for years, leaving the town she grew up in and heading off to college. Cheery and upbeat. That's how any one of her customers would describe Debra. For the past several months, she's been working at Mr. T's coffee shop on Park Avenue West in downtown Mansfield, Ohio. It's just around the corner from the first-floor apartment Debra lives in at 151 West 3rd Street, a rather sketchy part of town back in those days. Mansfield, Ohio in general, during the early 1980s, could be a dangerous place, especially the neighborhood Debra has called home for the better part of her life. Around the area where Debra lives are suburban neighborhoods, segregated into ethnic groups, much like any major city in America. One of the problems driving the crime rates up in Mansfield during the late 70s and early 80s became that scores of blue-collar jobs in the big factories were being lost after companies moved and closed. So people had nowhere else to turn for work. And with upwards of over 50,000 people living in the city, many of whom are now out of work and bored, law enforcement does its best to deal with an uptick in serious crime. Debra doesn't seem all that worried, because her plan involves getting the hell out of the city and beginning a new life somewhere far away the minute she tosses that graduation cap into the air and screams, holding her graduation certificate in her hands. Being a waitress at Mr. T's, or anywhere else for that matter, during the early 80s, especially for an 18-year-old woman like Debra, was a different and difficult job. Debra has short black hair cut just below her ears. She's street smart, intelligent, confident, and pretty in a non-provocative way. Back then, sexual harassment became something most women were forced to endure, knowing that nothing was ever done about it. 1 in 4 females, in fact, experienced sexual harassment on a daily basis. For waitresses, there was the added stress of creeps walking in and treating you like an object until they left, with zero repercussion. If you complained to your boss, you were a liability and let go. If you complained to police, they laughed you out of the station house. That's just how it was then. So Debra, by now, is used to the average dirty old man, or more aggressive and vile young men, coming into Mr. T's and giving her a problem. She chalks it up to just one more reason to focus on her dream of heading off to college and getting out of the city. On April 29, 1981, a Wednesday, Debra is at home. She had worked the previous night, Tuesday, until 10 p.m. After completing her shift at Mr. T's, she went out until about 2 a.m. with a young man in his late 20s whose identity has been a mystery for 40-plus years. Debra's parents had split up. Her dad lives in California, her mom in Mansfield. Born in Cleveland with 8 brothers and sisters, all from Mansfield, Deb also feels a bit lost within her own family. It seems everyone is doing their own thing. Outgoing, friendly, compassionate, and liked by nearly every one of her classmates, Deb didn't know it, but she is about to be named Best Personality by her fellow Malabar students. What a great send-off for a girl who seemed to be able to, at just 18 years old, take care of herself. Unbeknownst to Debra, over the past 2 months in Mansfield, there had been 4 murders. Going back 12 months, several more. Just about a half mile away, to the north, up on West 3rd Street, 24-year-old Diana Shaw was found stabbed to death inside her apartment. Mansfield police have been stumped. Early indications don't show any type of connection among the murders, but it doesn't stop people from talking about the possibility of a serial killer at large in the city. So in response to what is a growing swell of criticism surrounding how police have handled the murders, Mansfield Police Department Major James Goldsmith goes to the media and explains that there has not been a rash of murders. People are spreading rumors, he says. There's all kinds of stories going on out here, the lieutenant running the Detective Bureau adds, after making a plea for any information residents think they might have about any of the recent murders in town. Diana Shaw died from strangulation and multiple stab wounds, but Mansfield police were quick to note that she had not been sexually assaulted. Shaw was a cocktail waitress at a place called Soprano Bar. What's interesting about all of these cases, giving us some insight into how different these times were for murder investigations, is how police describe Diana Shaw to reporters, saying that she was, quote, friendly with some of the patrons she served and had invited some of them back to her apartment. The impression they give is that Diana is somehow to blame for winding up a victim of murder, and that she likely invited her killer into her home. Diana had a 4-year-old child who was not at home at the time of her murder. Her husband was in prison serving 7 to 25 years for a rape and another 3 to 15 years for kidnapping. Again, they mentioned this to reporters in order to insinuate that Diana Shaw was hanging around bad people, and when you hang around scumbags, bad things might happen to you. Victim shaming and blaming. That's what this is. Things didn't get any better for police when, about 6 months after Diana's murder, 21-year-old Deborah Ann Holbrook went missing just outside the city limits after leaving her mother's house. It was Holbrook's mother who reported her missing on June 26, 1980. Holbrook was on her way back to the city. About a week later, her nude body is found by a camp counselor along a stretch of woods in Mifflin Township, not too far from where her mother lives. Holbrook had been stabbed to death. The local sheriff's department comes out and, in one breath, says it will spare no expense to solve the case. And then in another says they cannot afford to pay any overtime, and anyone working the case will have to trade working overtime for future time off. The difference in the two cases investigators are quick to share is that Diana Shaw's body was mutilated and Holbrook's wasn't. I'm not sure that's enough to write off any possible connection, but you have to understand that investigators are dealing with pre-DNA and forensic technology cases here, when murder investigations relied heavily on theory, trace evidence, and instinct. Science isn't driving murder investigations as it is today. You were basically going on what you had in front of you, whereas today, you rely more on what you cannot even see. Then it is discovered that Deborah Holbrook and Diana Shaw had hung around some of the same bars. So the consideration is that the cases very well might be connected. The red brick apartment building Debra Miller, the 18-year-old waitress preparing to graduate high school, lives in, is a bit run down. Broken windows, flimsy railings leading up filthy stairwells with graffiti all around you. The 120-year-old building was once a college and houses mostly elderly people. The only reason Deb wound up alone is that she had been living with her grandmother, who had recently passed away. On that Wednesday, April 29th, 1981, Deborah doesn't show up for school, which is out of the norm for her. Nobody in the building, obviously, knows this. But the super, who happens to own the building and does all of the maintenance around the place, is making his daily rounds that morning, checking on all of the tenants when he comes to Debra Miller's apartment and notices that her door is open. Which is strange. No one in the building leaves their door open. Not in this neighborhood. So he approaches slowly before easing the creaky door open all the way. And the first thing he sees is blood. Lots of it. Spattered everywhere. Sticking his head inside to look around further, the guy can see what is later described by police as one of the most gruesome crime scenes they had ever encountered. My longtime listeners know that I rarely suggest podcasts, yet a good friend who is responsible for bringing me into the podcast arena, Lauren Bright Pacheco, an incredibly detailed and tenacious Emmy Award-winning producer, investigative journalist, and veteran podcaster, just launched her latest, Murder on Songbird Road, a multi-part limited series from iHeartMedia focused on the stabbing death of 11-year-old Jade Marie Beasley in the contentious conviction of her father's fiancé. I cannot recommend this series enough. You can listen to Murder on Songbird Road on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your favorite shows. I'll be right back after a short break. Between 1965 and 2022, 340 homicide and manslaughter cases went unsolved. The year 1981 is one of those within that piece of crime history most would rather forget than look back on. A year considered to be one of the most active, I would say, as far as high-profile serial killers are concerned. In Ohio, particularly, the most famous name to later come out of that era would have to be Samuel Little, who ultimately admits to strangling 93 women between 1970 and 2005. A figure the FBI claims is credible, as agents have verified 50 of those confessions so far. Sam Little is a monster of the worst type, active for 35 years that we know of. Many of his victims' deaths were at first attributed to undetermined causes or accidental overdoses. Important to me is what Little later says about his victims, that he believed he would never be caught because he thought nobody in their lives had been accounting for them. A statement like that confirms for me how most serial killers view their victims, as objects whose lives don't matter to those around them. This is an important factor for most of these guys when choosing victims. The statement also tells me how law enforcement and the media need to change their viewpoint of how women in general and murder victims are presented publicly. And I am not just talking about 1981. I mean today as well. I say this all the time on the show, but a murder victim is a victim, period. What he or she did, the choices he or she had made in life, has no bearing on how they should be presented to the public. Labeling murder victims only further empowers the serial killer. Sam Little literally tells us this after he is caught. He felt invincible while he was killing. I've had serial killers tell me the same thing. She wouldn't be missed, and I knew that, which is why I chose to kill her. Other active serial killers during the early 1980s are recognizable names today. Henry Lee Lucas, Donald Harvey, Dahmer, Robert Lee Yates, Carl Eugene Watts, BTK, Otis O'Toole, Ed Edwards, Ted Bundy. The list goes on and on. Murder rates back then were 50% higher than they are today. Serial killer task forces and investigations were going on in every major city across the country. It just seemed that for a single woman living alone, no matter who you were or what you did, you had a target on your back. Thank God for technology and science too. Within the next, say, 15 to 20 years, make huge strides in helping to catch killers and rapists. That maintenance man who owns the building where Debra Miller lives realizes that something horrible has taken place inside her apartment. He, of course, calls it in, and Mansfield police soon arrive to process the crime scene. Debra's body is ultimately found inside her apartment, in her bedroom. And it's clear, although police don't mention this at first, that her attacker did not break into her apartment. A bloody crime scene like that of which investigators came upon inside Debra Miller's apartment can tell them a bit about what happened. If there are foot and handprints in the blood on the floor, smeared and streaked, it says a struggle took place after whatever trauma occurred. This can tell investigators some things about the attacker. His or her strength, maybe a shoe print, a fingerprint. As they searched the apartment looking for a weapon, they had first come up empty-handed. I think when most inexperienced crime scene investigators begin looking at a scene like the one inside Debra's apartment, their mindset is stuck on searching for a knife or some sort of familiar weapon. It's a natural response. In this case, however, it is then learned that Debra had actually been beaten with pots, pans, and a burner grate from a gas stove. You know, one of those cast iron, kind of star-shaped with pointy metal arms sticking out grates seated around the end where the gas flows and fires. If you've ever handled one, you understand how hard and dangerous it could be if used as a weapon. The autopsy shows Debra had been beaten about the head and neck and died as a result of blunt force trauma. What I see is a burst of volcanic rage. Debra's killer snapped and grabbed the closest objects he could find to use as a weapon, which is not the mark of a serial killer. Serial killers are notoriously known to be more organized and methodical than grabbing a cast iron gas stove grate, pots and pans, and beating someone to death with those items. They don't generally kill in the spur of the moment. They plan, they stalk, they lurk in the shadows until they are ready, and they bring their own weapons. This murder feels a bit more inspired by something that had happened between Debra and her killer. Debra is also found naked. So, in that respect, her murder has a bit of consistency with the two I mentioned earlier. One in the same basic neighborhood 18 months before, and the other outside the city limits 6 months after that. Investigative methods were far different than they are today. They didn't have the tools or technology to do what we all take for granted today. Think about it for a minute. Even the idea of tying cases together by similarities. If we view this within today's context, it's a given that algorithms and computers connect cases all the time, and investigators can share those common crime scene characteristics with departments all over the country in minutes. But in 1981, those connections were only as good as the communication between departments. Investigators begin knocking on doors around the apartment building to get a bead on anyone that might have seen or heard anything. One of Debra's neighbors, James Van Est, a guy in his late 20s living above her, is one of the first tenants they speak to. Van Est is questioned about what he might have heard downstairs, but the guy has very little to offer. As far as a potential suspect, police never view Van Est in that way. Yes, he saw Debra around the building. No, he really didn't know her. And that is about all they do with James Van Est at that time. The common theory among most is that some type of vagrant or homeless person might have bothered Debra on her way home from work or that bar she went to because she walked and followed her into her apartment. Things became heated. The guy snapped, and Debra wound up dead. But the question is, why was she nude? That is a telling sign of either sexual assault as a motive or that Debra had sexual relations with someone she knew and things took a deadly turn at some point afterward. The case goes cold almost immediately after the first round of routine inquiries around town and the apartment complex go nowhere. As the decade comes to a close and Debra's case has been all but forgotten about, serious allegations arise, pointing to police officers involved with links to several murdered women around the city, Debra's case included, sexual assault, and also harassment. In fact, the entire investigation into Debra's case is rife with allegations of gross police misconduct and malfeasance. It seems some of the officers investigating Debra's case were involved with all sorts of crimes against women, and it's possible that those crimes led to murder in order to cover up all of that misconduct. So the mayor of the city decides he wants an internal investigation. By the time that investigation is concluded, no officers are linked to Debra's murder or any of the others. The investigation, however, exposes the sexual involvement of many officers with Debra Miller and the growing question of whether she was a willing participant and the sex was consensual or she had been assaulted. So I don't see how they can't put the two together. But this entire police misconduct investigation disrupts Debra's case. It gets pushed to the side. The Mansfield police chief retires in 1990, but only after several formal complaints are filed over an investigation into the strange death of a Mansfield police patrolman's ex-wife. So there's a lot going on here within this department. Between 1981, Debra's murder, and 1990, when the chief retires, there are so many problems within the department. It's not surprising, actually, that those investigators who care about Debra's case and the others cannot get anything done. The chief's retirement, though, opens up a new era in the department, and several new investigators, with fresh eyes, I might add, are now on board to take a serious look at Debra's brutal murder, which many of them believe is entirely solvable. Not only based on the progress of DNA technology, but the amount of evidence left at that crime scene. Even with all of that momentum, it will be another 30-plus years and one tenacious investigator who refuses to let go before Debra Miller's killer is caught. I'll get into that next. In 2021, a retired Mansfield Police Department lieutenant goes to one of the department's current detectives and asks him to look at Debra's case. The retired lieutenant believes one small piece of information can solve the case, and new technology is the means to the end they all want. That detective then goes to a DNA analyst, and they decide to look at Debra's murder as if it is a new current case which had just come in. They reread everything, conduct new interviews, submit any evidence never submitted, and resubmit any that has. Sometimes with cold cases, more so today than ever, that is really all you have to do. And as they get into it, one name keeps coming up. James Van Est, that upstairs neighbor of Debra's, who was never considered a viable suspect. Back in 2017, the FBI actually looked into Debra's case. They identified a fingerprint found inside her apartment, but the guy had died, so it seemed that pursuing that lead was futile. Her case went cold again. As the detective and a DNA analyst begin reviewing everything in 2021, a DNA profile jumped out of their reanalysis of the blood and trace evidence. It took several years to get there, but that one profile kept coming back. James Van Est. Van Est's profile had been mixed in with Debra's DNA on most of the tests. More than that, Van Est's DNA was found all over the murder weapons, those pots and pans, and the iron stove grate. There is no doubt James Van Est had murdered Debra Miller. The detective locates Van Est, now a 68-year-old man living in Canton, Ohio. After asking him just a few basic questions, Van Est begins to talk about that day of the murder in 1981, now 40-plus years later, as if he just watched a film of it. The detail he recalls is unmistakable and a huge red flag to the detective. There was a homeless guy that had been trying to break into her apartment, Van Est says. I ran him off. Did you know her? The detective asks. I told Debbie about running the homeless guy off, and she was appreciative. Early that morning of the 29th, I was coming home from a bar. She invited me in. We had sex. I then got sick and had to leave. That's his story. So now Van Est has just admitted to being inside her apartment on the day she was murdered, and the detective knows that he is saying this because he must realize they have his DNA, both blood and bodily fluids, and he needs to explain why both were present in the apartment. The detective builds his case over the next 3 years. In June 2024, it's time to confront Van Est and tell him they have his DNA and believe he murdered Debra. Van Est refuses to talk to them anymore and requests a lawyer, so they have to allow him to leave until they can secure an arrest warrant. And if you're asking yourself, why does it take all those extra years between when he is first questioned in 2021 and 2024? This is a standard cold case investigation timeframe. Other cases come in and you are pulled off. You wait in a DNA line, so to speak, at the lab, which can take years. And then you need to convince a prosecutor and the judge to sign off on warrants. As they continue to work on an indictment for James Van Est, he sells his home, buys a trailer and a truck, and takes off toward the East Coast. He knows the end is near and decides to run. Van Est is arrested in West Virginia after he is stopped, and they find 2 weapons he is not supposed to have, because James Van Est, it turns out, has a long history of criminal behavior and is a convicted felon. By now, the prosecutor is prepared to take the case into the grand jury and indict Van Est on murder. Van Est posts bond in West Virginia and heads back to Ohio and is now living in a shitty, skanky North Canton motel, seemingly holed up, waiting for the ball to drop. SWAT officers and the U.S. Marshal Service are tasked with locating Van Est as a fugitive from justice in West Virginia. The reason for all the troops is that they had found a cache of weapons inside Van Est's home he left behind. Also, the fact that he was caught in West Virginia with firearms and has an extensive history of committing violent crimes dating all the way back into the early 1970s. I guess once a shitbag, always a shitbag. After knocking on the motel room door, Van Est makes it clear he is not coming out. He then actually hunkers down inside the room and pushes all of the furniture up against the door as if he is some sort of villain in a Hollywood film. After they make contact with Van Est, without warning, he starts shooting. One SWAT team member is hit in the arm. With scores of officers facing the door, they open fire and kill Van Est within a few minutes. The prosecutor working the case comes out and says they are convinced Debra Lee Miller's murderer has been brought to justice. Sometimes justice comes in the form of violence. James Van Est chose his ending. The case, as far as Debra's family and law enforcement are concerned, is closed. That'll do it for this week. And before I go, please get over to patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps and sign up for my free content page, where I'll be interacting with you, doing live streams, posting exclusive content, sending out newsletters, and dropping a major limited series podcast exclusively for Patreon members later this year. That's patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. Be safe, be aware. Sources for this episode include police reports and warrant affidavits. Evidence lacking to link 3 similar murders by Roger Nielsen, News Journal, May 2nd, 1981. DNA helps to solve brutal 43-year-old Mansfield murder case by Carl Hunnell, The Richland Source, December 30th, 2024. Ohio police solve 40-year-old murder mystery after a deadly standoff. Sean O'Driscoll, Newsweek, December 31st, 2024. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinus, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.